Hello, and welcome to the Dolby Institute podcast. This is a show about how artists use technology to tell their stories, and I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you will find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. We're continuing our coverage of the 2023 Academy Awards. Today we're talking to the sound team behind another film that is on the shortlist for the Best Sound Academy Award, Avatar: The Way of Water. If you've seen this latest installment of James Cameron's epic series, then you already know how visually dazzling it is. But it also features an absolutely incredible sound design and a stunning Dolby Atmos sound mix. Joining us today to talk about the film is four-time Academy Award-winning re-recording mixer, supervising sound editor, and sound designer Christopher Boyes, supervising sound editor Dick Bernstein, re-recording mixer Michael Hedges, sound mixer Julian Howarth, and returning to our show, supervising sound editor Gwendolyn Yates, who we all know as Gwen. She was a guest very early on in our first season of the podcast. And if you don't know that much about the art and the craft of dialogue editing, that you go back and check out that conversation with Gwen. It's a deep dive into that particular part of the sound art, and it's a great episode. You'll find a link to that in our show notes. But today we're discussing the second Avatar film, and this was an epic undertaking that took almost a decade for Jim Cameron to bring to the screen. And in fact, the sound team started really early. I know that Chris Boyes actually started working on this film over 5 years ago. So that's where we started the conversation, asking Chris, what were those initial explorations into the sound design of the film? Here's Chris.
We started having conversations with John Landau, and he said, I want to get you down here and play you some stuff and show you our setup down at Manhattan Beach, which was pretty impressive. This is obviously long before COVID. So we both went down. We screened some stuff in his new cinema. I had been talking to people that were working on building it prior to even getting involved. And then independently, we both read scripts. You go into a locked room, you give them your iPhone and all implements of writing, et cetera, and you go in and read a script and kind of take in what you can. And it's a bit of a large task because the script reads well in that it gives you a real descriptive narrative of components, but because it's a script, it doesn't really give you a map of what to start or where to start or all of that. And I guess it was 5 years ago. I'm so bad with dates, but it likely was 5 years ago that all began. What's been probably the biggest task for me early on and remained a challenge right until the last day really was the dialogue coming from the Tulkun, which are they are effectively marine mammals, and they are very much characters in the film and have a language of their own. And what's fun for the audience is that they come to learn that, and through Loak, which is one of the Sully family kids, we get introduced to Payakan, and Loak and Payakan figure out that they can talk, and Loak sort of comes to understand Payakan, and Payakan comes to understand Loak, and that's all sort of through this sound designed language. And that was kind of my biggest challenge on the film in a design sense that started really early on.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because I definitely had a note that I wanted to talk with you about that design challenge around the vocalizations of Payakan and just in general the Tulkun mammal race. And so I'm glad to hear that that's where you started, because I'm sure, as you said, that was one of the bigger challenges for you. For me, the character of Payakan, was one of the main characters of the film and was a character that I became as emotionally invested in as any of the Na'vi. And I know that a lot of that is due to the, the reactions that I was having to, to his vocalizations. So can you talk about, I'm curious about what the experimental, so if you started with that for 5 years and you said it went until the very end, tell us about what were some of the blind alleys that you went down? What did you try that didn't work, and how did you finally kind of unlock it?
That was you're exactly right. I mean, what I did initially was I put together, well, first of all, my son Daniel put together a trip for myself and Lucas Miller, who also worked on the film. The three of us flew to Maui and had an amazing recording experience recording humpback whales that to this day I've never heard vocalizations the way we captured them. So I was pretty excited about that. And then when I mentioned that to Jim, he wasn't too excited about that. So therein lies, the beginning of a path. So then I thought, okay, well,
wait a second. Jim wasn't too excited about it because he didn't want it to be too close to actual humpback whales, or like what?
Yeah, I think
he was like, Jim doesn't get excited about stuff in general.
No. I mean, he was at that time. He was sort of describing, he likened it to other, and I'm not going to use any of the examples, but he likened it to other characters that didn't ever speak a known human language, but became characters in film throughout history, and that. I needed to think about it from that perspective. And I think really what he was saying about the humpbacks is he loves the species, obviously. I mean, whales are a big part of his vision. But I think his feeling was that humpbacks tend to be one of the most recognizable marine mammal vocalizations to all of us. And they also tend to be really sing-songy. And all of that didn't really lend itself to creating a dialogue. And so what I did initially was I basically got into my sound design room at Skywalker, and for 2 weeks, I pulled through every recording. I had Lucas search every corner of the planet for sounds that we could purchase and license. And I poured through every single recording I could and started creating components, basically using, actually at the time, Contact, which is a Native Instruments program. Because typically I'd go to my synclavier, but I actually found Contact to be more appropriate for what I was doing. So I just went through all these recordings and found components and created literally hundreds and hundreds of vocalizations. And then Dave put them in the library.
But you also had this great idea that he was at PyCon, like Loak was a teenager and a lonely teenager, like an outcast. And so we recorded human vocals just because I actually recorded my neighbor kids and I made up a thing for them to say, or like a scenario. I didn't tell them what it was about. And they made up their own language, kind of like on the spot. And we tried it, but it always still felt too human. I mean, but it was a nice idea to kind of go to a lonely teenager. Yeah,
that was one of the many paths that I went down that we were really excited about. I basically pulled Gwen into the process because I thought to myself, well, nobody's better at dialogue than Gwen, and I said, Gwen, what if we actually record humans and I process that? And we used these wonderful recordings that Gwen made of her neighbors, as well as Kevin Dorman, who actually performed on the mocap. Well, I don't know, the performance capture stage, performed a lot of PyCon. Trying to capture what Jim was hearing, what he was
in his head.
Doing. Yeah. And in the end, I'll try and wrap it up because it's a big thing. But in the end, Jim got a hold of this big library that I made, and wisely, I wasn't really thinking about. I mean, I think I was thinking about PyCon a little bit, but I was thinking about Tulkun in general, and I wisely sort of named these all with emotional components like sad, angry, rage, happy. Like I really divided it into every emotion I could and attach, where the file spoke to me a certain emotion, I would give it that name. And unbeknownst to me, Jim started playing with, well, I mean, I guess I knew that he was playing with that, but he really started to dig into that early library and get some things that were working for him. And so as much as anything, PyCon was a collaboration really in the end between Jim and I, but I didn't really realize that for a long time because we kept thinking, no, we need to be more dialogue oriented. We need to work with the pacing and rhythm, which we did ultimately, but the pacing of rhythm of dialogue as we know it, as we understand it, so that it would make sense to us.
So it has a cadence. So
right. And then when I flew down to New Zealand, I started playing with other components, even musical instruments and things of that nature. And I developed about 3 different passes, and I played, I think, the first or second pass to Jim, and he goes, no, what do I have in the track now? Well, he had gotten used to what he had in the track now, and I was fine with that. I was absolutely fine with that. And then just to complete it, then, we actually then kind of went with that, and I started augmenting it with other components of sounds that I'd made. And once we got to a place where he felt like it was really working, then he said, I think it would be fun to do something in addition to this that's based on, whistles and things of that nature. So then I, which was really exciting. Now I had some feedback. We had a base to work with, and I went back to my room at Park Road Post then, and I, again, on Contact, I found all these marine mammal whistles and then little enunciations, and I performed all these things. And in the scene that we put out for the Academy, the very first scene where we meet PyCon, you see all of that at play. And I think it's really fun because you have this dialogue, but then when he gets excited and he's just, kind of not saying anything specific, he uses these whistles, and it's a lot of fun.
The thing that I hear from you is that, sound and the design of this character was important enough to Jim and to John Landau that they gave you the time to explore and to experiment and to make this work, because that character is so emotional, and I know that it's a large part of that is due to the sound design of the vocalizations.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think you're right. They gave me maybe too much time in some regards. The biggest challenge, and this was a challenge for all of us, is just getting time with Jim. I mean, he was just sort of pulled in so many directions. And I guess it was a measure of confidence in what we do. He kind of didn't have time to really give us the direct attention until sort of later in the final, once the final mix started. And it would have been great to sit with him long before that. And maybe some of these paths I would have abandoned. But I definitely got my the amount of sounds made that didn't get used, but are cool sounds and will be used eventually, is in the thousands.
You guys started in Manhattan Beach, which is in near Los Angeles, and so was that where the mocap was happening, and then the live action, because there's there's a tremendous amount of live action with the humans that are on Pandora. Now, was that shot in New Zealand, or what was kind of the division of things? And how did you guys? At what point did you guys go to Park Road? Like, kind of walk me through the various phases of the production.
It started all of the planning and everything. As you know, Chris built the thing at Manhattan Beach, and then we built 3 performance capture stages. There were 2 side by side that we could join together to make an even bigger volume that we used for the regular performance capture. And then we built, and then once we started performance capture, late 2017, we started on the 2 volumes. And in that time, we were building the water tank on the 3rd volume. And that was, again, ongoing testing to make sure that we can do performance capture underwater, to make the cameras work. Is it it's a different light? It's infrared? Is it ultraviolet? It's all those questions that were being asked. And we were having to answer while we were filming on the first 2 stages. And then you were getting questions about, how can we develop that? We had a test tank on a 4th stage just for the hell of it. I mean, why not? And it was that constant research and development to fine tune it, because you knew And in 2017, we knew we were going into a water stage, and there were various problems. And we were kind of 8 months after that, we knew we'd start to film in it. So you kind of had this 8-month lead in where you would. I remember I was like nervous as because we were building things. That were going in the water tank. Would it work? How would we do like communication underwater? How would they do the capture? How would we make? How would I make a microphone work from 30 foot under the water to break at the surface and be working? All those questions, and more with all the other departments is like, how do we get that? And it was a huge collaboration from everybody. There was no point where you kind of have a distinctive job. At this point, everybody overlapped. Even in our sound department here, everybody, like Gwen with Chris, we all overlapped. I overlapped with Dick and with Simon Franklin. It was like a huge collaboration, which is massively satisfying. Frankly, then you normally get these corridors that you've got to stay in, and when you get to overlap and collaborate a bit more, it's like this huge appreciation of the people you're working with, what they do and how they do it. And then all of this is just to keep up with Jim. And he just, I want to do this. And you kind of go, okay. And how long have we got? And you're like, 8 months. And I can remember the first comment I got from him. Sorry to detract about this. I remember the first comment is to enable performance capture in water for the cameras to work. We had to cover the surface. We'll talk about this later as well with Gwen. The surface of the water is covered with like 10,000 ping pong balls, which sound horrific. And I don't know if this is a podcast or not, but I can remember talking to Jim about it. He's like, look, we've got this. What are your expectations? It's that grab 5 minutes, try and get as much information out of him as you can, and then you can work with it. And I was like, what do we want? He said, look, he said, all I'm worried about is not hearing the goddamn fucking balls. And that was it. that was his first. He says, I don't want to hear those goddamn balls. And I was like, well, balls indeed, Jim. And you kind of go away like, what can we do? So, it was developed from that, and then we went to the tank. And then, it was 2 years later, then we'd been filming in the tank in terms of timeline. Then we started to build, crew came up from New Zealand to meet us. So we had Tony Johnson, the production sound mixer from New Zealand, who an incredible job, who came up to join me for 2 weeks to kind of like, to sit down to see what methods we got in place. We had a lot of things that we kind of invented to kind of help on the mocap stage that Jim wanted to take down to New Zealand. Again, we can talk about that a bit more. And so then we developed, at that point, when everybody started to come up, it was the 3D cameras to test those out. Those were all tested. So the systems were tested in Manhattan Beach. So everything was built. We had a spider cam, which was an island camera that went through the actual live sets, which played back the animation of the Na'vi to the humans. So you could have a moving eye line, so everybody on set, to make it look right, because that's always the thing with CGI in a live action shoot, is eye lines tend not to look great, or that you've got somebody waving about a tennis ball that doesn't quite fit in, and it was trying to make that work, and again, full collaboration. It's the spider cam grips. We've got playback from the mocap, the performance capture guys, the motion builders. We got directional speakers on the spider cam, so the blue person could talk, or he could talk into earpieces. So we had that, and then we also, and it was making that work. And then it was also the initial costume review of like where we were going to put radio mics in costumes, and then this how we're going to work with that. Spider, our big concern is a guy. It's the Tarzan thing, isn't it? A guy in a loincloth in a wide shot. And Jim wants to hear tight dialogue. What are you going to do? And at that point,
and he's always wearing a mask.
And he's always wearing a mask, but those masks are without, and you can build things in. But there's sometimes he's inside and he's not wearing a mask. It's like, and again, what are you going to do? And we built, so his radio mic and his microphone was built into his wig. So one of the dreadlocks is actually his transmitter in his hairpiece. We built all that piece, and that kind of went in. And then once, Tony and I had a collaboration for 2 weeks, we swapped ideas. That was all built. And then I can't remember the year we went, it all went off, and we packed everything in a box. And then it went to New Zealand for live action capture, where they built the sets and the 3D cameras and all the spider to link in with what we'd done. And so went to New Zealand, and then you had another 2 years in New Zealand, which kind of finished the live action capture, and then went straight into post. At which point I was And I stayed here in LA. Tony Johnson took over with his incredible crew. I mean, amazing. And then, and I stayed here for occasional, what we called FPR or ADR sessions over here. We'd still record, and we were still doing stunt work, performance capture stunt work in LA while they were still doing live action in New Zealand. So, and again, another thing was a pipeline across the world where you could get instantaneous picture, sound, and you could direct backwards and forwards. You could operate Avid systems or Pro Tools systems from either end of this pipeline remotely from the other end.
I'm exhausted just listening to all that. It's what an extraordinary achievement. And of course, leave it to Jim Cameron. He can never make a film in a simple fashion. It's got to be groundbreaking at every. So Gwen, it's very rare that we have the production sound mixer with us for these conversations. So not to put you on the spot, but Julian's right here. How did you do? How were those production tracks? It sounds like it was a very challenging setup.
He was really great. I mean, the balls in the pool was probably the worst thing we had to deal with, because there's balls in the pool and you can't do anything about that. I remember that's the day we actually went to the set, and I saw you, and you just kind of looked at me. You went, because what are you going to do? But we used, I'd say we used probably 75% of all the production that was recorded. We did ADR for extra stuff, extra breathing things, that kind of thing. As the CGI came in, we would do that. A lot of this FPR, facial performance recording, is that what that stands for?
I think it is. It's the same as what does ADR? There's 7 different translations. MOS again, mixer out smoking, mute out sound.
What does that mean exactly? Is that sort of like like ADR for the performance capture of the face, or what exactly is?
So it's the kind of thing where Jim would play them, the performance that they did either with the balls or with some other weird squeaky plywood thing underneath it, and they would record the face as well as the voice. So it's kind of ADR with the face, so that they can animate to the new performance if Jim likes it better, and it makes sync a lot easier if they do it right. So there was a lot of that. They did a lot of that with Spider as he grew up, because Spider started as 12 years old, and then he was 17, and he sounded very different. So they had to kind of put the older Spider into all these scenes. So a lot of his stuff was done FPR, because they would record all his facial expressions at the same time. We did do some traditional ADR, not a ton, but some of the water stuff that Tony Johnson did on these boats, where they're just screaming into these mics, just because that stuff kind of had to, just for major distortion. And Tony did the best he could, but that's, again, it's kind of like the balls in the pool. It's kind of like luckily we do have ADR, which is a very powerful tool, and we used it. And there's also this miraculous program that Peter Jackson's people came up with, and our lead dialogue editor, Marty Kwok, he was one of the lead designers on it. They used it on Get Back. It's called MAL, M-A-L. And it was really great also for overlaps, but it could take, if you had 2 people overlapped, it would figure out the voices and separate them, and it would keep the performances, and there was no artifacting. And so you could have, Kiri and Loak, and you could then, just pull them apart. Or if you had these ball things, it would separate the ball noise from the sound of the water, and then the voice. And it was pretty remarkable. We didn't use a lot of it. We used some of it mostly after we'd already done the ADR and the takes changed and there was major overlaps. We would do it there, or if sometimes the actors, bless their hearts, can't quite get back to that original performance. There are some places I know on the scene where Kevin Dorman was being Payakan behind Loak. The actor, he came really close, but it wasn't quite right. We used Mal to pull Kevin Dorman's Payakan out from the overlap with the actor. And I defy anyone to tell me what's what, because it sounds great.
I am so fascinated by this Mal technology, and I feel like I want to do a podcast just on that. I mean, Michael, I know that you used the Mal technology quite a bit on Peter Jackson's Beatles documentary, because you had those mono recordings, right? You needed to separate the vocals from the music, from the instrumentation, and it sounds just like a miraculous black box.
It's totally amazing. I don't want to go too much into the detail, but what we used on the Beatles, we first started just trying to separate the vocals. Peter was the Beatles had a strange habit of playing loud music when they wanted to have a quiet conversation. So Peter discovered that we could somehow clean this up. And when we've all heard karaoke versions of these things, but Mal took it to the next level, and we were able to separate dialogue. Not only dialogue, we were able to separate all of the Beatles, and then we got into music separation. So, what we ended up using, I guess, on Avatar was a simpler form in reality. And I think a podcast on it would be fantastic. But to be able to get separation where you cannot tell the difference of quality between the characters, and it certainly is a groundbreaking tool for the future. It's something fantastic.
Before we move on from dialogue and performance, there were just a couple things that kind of stood out for me. Gwen, you mentioned having these kid actors, and obviously with a multi-year production process, you got some of those kids that are going to hit puberty. So I presume that you grabbed some ADR early on.
That was around 2019. I went down and did some sessions with. The only person I didn't do sessions with was Spider, and I think it's because he knew that he had to be FPR just because he was physically so different as well. I mean, at least she was always a little in blue and Loak, and then Nataeum was older to begin with, I think. So he probably, I don't know, Julian, you can help me. I don't know if Nataeum changed that much because he was already...
Jamie didn't change that much. The changes for me that were most remarkable was Jack in his voice. He grew 3 foot out and up, and his voice completely changed. Trinity was a big change, and then Bailey was also quite a change. I think for me it was Jack, and Britton played Loak. But I think it was Trinity and Jack were the two that I just saw huge changes from.
Because Trinity was 6 and then she was 12, so that is a big thing. But at least she was always blue, so they could, But it was funny because she lost her cheeks. She lost her baby cheeks. So. That's
so funny. Well, and then of course you've got one character who goes in the opposite direction. You've got Sigourney Weaver, excuse me, playing a 15-year-old. So I'm just curious, and obviously we don't have Gary Summers today, who did a fantastic job mixing the dialogue on the film. But I'm curious, did you guys do anything to Sigourney Weaver's vocal tracks to make her sound, like Kiri, the 15-year-old?
To give Sigourney full credit, she did that all by herself. When she was Kiri, I mean. Actually, Zoe Saldana's talked about it as well. She would, Sigourney would walk in, she'd be herself. And then by the time she got onto the mocap stage, she was this mopey, volatile 14-year-old. And naturally, because of that, her voice pitched up a little bit. She did that all by herself. I didn't touch her.
Amazing. And then, of course, I think one of the performances that just struck me so beautiful, Zoe Saldana's performance as Neytiri, just extraordinary, so emotional. And so how much of that was captured during the mocap, and how much of that was ADR? Or?
We are doing motion capture, but we're also capturing emotion. This was the whole bit when you said about Zoe Saldana, we're there to not just capture motion, we're capturing emotion. And that's why we kind of try and refer it as a performance capture stage, because that's what Avatar is. We're not just doing it, we're capturing, it's everything that they're doing, we're capturing. And that transferal, and like you said, that performance from Zoe is outstanding. I mean, it floors me every time. She's incredible, and it's so natural. As for how much we used, I'm there to try and protect performances as much as we can. ADR is a tool that again, as a production mixer, I don't feel ashamed about ADR. It's a marvelous tool, and it's a creative tool, and it's everything that we do. So it's a balance between the two.
You also recorded it too.
Yeah. So I recorded that too. So it's it's a tool that we love. But the thing I think I remember about Zoe in the performance that get me, and Dick will attest to this, is and I know I pipe on about it, but it's like I'm really quite proud of it. Is the song chord that Zoe sings that was recorded on stage? That was not recorded in a studio. That was recorded on stage at Manhattan Beach. Simon and Dick came down. We brought the track. We started to rehearse the little track. We worked on to get the pitch right with Zoe, and then she just went and hammered that whole song out on the stage, and that was it. There was no studio work without, and that's, for those kind of things, we worked really hard to protect that performance.
Amazing. Dick, you've been so patient. I want to bring you into the conversation here. Dick, I know that you worked really closely with the composer Simon Franklin, and obviously, James Horner did the score for the original film and did such a beautiful job on it. Tragically, he passed away before Avatar 2 went into production. So Simon stepped in. Can you talk about your process collaborating with Simon? And obviously, as Julian just told us, there was a certain amount of pre-recording that happened, and that process of integrating the score into the sound design.
Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to reunite with my buds here. It's always good to see their faces. James's death left a huge hole in our team. Simon was Simon, and Simon Rhodes, our scoring mixer. Other people were part of James's team, and after we had already started having meetings with Disney about the world of Avatar in Disney World in Florida, and after James's death, Simon Franklin continued and completed the world of Avatar, and I was lucky enough to be able to help out on that. And part of it was that since we had been working in that Avatar world, Simon got tapped to do the on-set music, the songs, some dancing, and some rituals for the performance capture. So Julian ran the playback, and we were there, and we were also part of a team that they called it the culture team, which was kind of putting our heads together to work on what an indigenous culture should look like. And Simon invented some musical instruments that then got 3D printed. And that was, I guess we started doing that in about 2018. The Disney stuff for Avatar World was 2016. And then eventually Simon got tapped to do the final score. And we got moved down to New Zealand. He got there in January of last year now. And I got there in April. And various other members of the team came and left. Stephen Baker, orchestrator, Darren Hall, music editor, Graham Foote, another orchestrator, and Simon Rhodes came down for months, and I got to meet Hedges, and we kind of worked in isolation at that point because of COVID stuff, and the score was being developed, and then everything came together on the mixing stage. That's when finally we all caught up with each other and had to deal with the collision of worlds, and it became apparent within the first couple of weeks that we were all going to have to set aside everything and work together and support each other and become a cohesive whole, because we were fighting this looming deadline, and there was so much to do and so many hours and kind of relentless concentration. And we really had to become, unlike any picture I've ever worked on, a team. And we had this whiteboard out in the hall, and every day we would see the days ticking off, and had our meals together. And that was your job, Gwen. So it was Jim Cameron sculpted the whole second by second the sound of the movie, and certainly he had his fingers in the music deeply. Everything had to go through him before it got to the stage. And, we all compromised, and we all gave way, and we all worked together and took our turns. And we've got a product that really coheres and is transparent enough that you can hear what's going on.
For sure. And one of the things that I noticed, I've seen the movie twice, and the first time, Gwen, I actually saw you. The first time I saw the movie was at the Academy Museum in LA, where I got to see it in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, and you were part of the conversation, post-screening conversation.
I just basically spoke for Chris Boyce because it was an effects.
Yeah, you did a great job.
Okay.
But one of the things that stood out for me both the times that I've watched the film is just the astonishing to me, just the clarity of the track. There's so much going on visually. And I feel like the sound is taking a very specific approach and almost leading my attention through this crazy visual world. And I feel like in the mix, the decisions about what you guys chose to focus on it's almost more important what you didn't put in the mix, because I feel like it's very clear you're taking us through it very, very specifically. And I feel like this mix was probably a big exercise in subtraction. So I'd love to, Chris and Mike, for you to talk about that and that approach to just this amazing clarity of this track.
I believe it was maybe coined on Terminator, but it was a term that Jim has used in the past, which we've all sort of, recanted many times. And that is, clarity is king. And, that really was the edict that we worked under. And the problem with getting clarity or transparency, and you really kind of hit it on the head, Glenn, it's all of the departments, music, dialogue with crowds, and all of this. And then obviously the sound effects world with, backgrounds, Foley, and then what we call hard effects, which are the more traditional sound effects. We deliver a palette that it really can't play. All of that just can't play. And in fact,
it can't play together. It can't play all at once.
It can't play all at once without it being just a collision of ideas and components. The problem is that you can't say, okay, well, if they can't all play together, then just pick the pieces that will play. Well, as Dick pointed out, you pick those pieces second by second or frame by frame. And so in order to get a transparent track, which is what a film like Avatar desperately needs, it's exactly what you said, Glenn. It's subtraction. It's subtraction of backgrounds. It's subtraction of Foley. It's subtraction of sound effects. But in the music department, which Mike and Dick can speak to, it's listening to a cue and saying, great, well, these beating drums are happening while we have gunfire on screen. We have to support that gunfire. Therefore, the drums are not going to play. And that's kind of, like known to us as mixers, but very few directors. A lot of times directors just won't sort of be willing to take apart their music to support their gunfire, for instance. And Jim has no fear of doing that. And that's a good thing. It's hard on all of us because, we're taking away these components that we would really play in and of themselves, by themselves, play amazingly well. But that was the edict that we worked through. And in order to get there, it was frame by frame, second by second, and multiple. We would go through and get it sort of working. We'd do a playback. Then we'd spend another day going through and cleaning and really sort of focusing. And this just went on for a really long time. And that whiteboard just kept getting updated and updated. And in the end, Avatar visually is such a complicated image. And I think the human brain can easily take that in and enjoy it. But we, delivering the sound of Avatar, have to work against that because the human brain can look at all those beautiful visuals, but can't necessarily process 1,000 different sonic notions. Really, we want to simplify it and get the sound to speak to the story that we're trying to tell. And if it's not part of the story, it doesn't belong in the track. And what that comes down to is a track that in many ways is very simplified so that we're telling the story.
It's well put, Chris. I think the big thing for us was that Jim was so precise. And I think we've all said it was a long period. And Dick, you said that deadline was looming. And I think that played a part on Jim being extremely detailed. He wanted to go through each department. He would start with the dialogue. He would make sure that we're hearing every line, every breath, which became so important in Avatar. Then we would go through the music, and there were a huge score. There's 3 hours of score, which plays magnificently. It's Simon and Dick and Darren worked so hard on presenting not just a score, but an emotional journey that we went on that was orchestrated with native instruments, with so many different things, and that had to play against music and effects. And as Chris said, we would work with the score. We would listen against the dialogue. Then we would add in Chris's department. And Jim was precise. He would go through it, choose what he wanted. We would then run the reel. And sometimes they were a traffic crash. It was there were quite a few moments where we're going, oh my God, that didn't work. And tension built in the room, let's say. But again, it was a process that had to happen, and we would get notes. We would work through those notes, and we think, oh, we're done. No, we'll watch it again. Jim will sit in his chair, and he'll listen, and he'll go, okay, we didn't get it quite right. We'll go back and we'll refine those moments. And I think to the beauty and the emotion of Avatar, the score, the sound effects, the environments, you get captivated by all of those things, and you forget that every piece of water is actually created, every drum beat is created, every vocal is created, and you get captured, and you forget all of the story all of the things that you know that aren't real. You get taken into Pandora. You get taken on a journey. Jim is very creative and very precise in what he wants, and I think it turned out pretty well.
Yeah, very well said. I'd like to at this point. I'd love to actually kind of dive into a little bit of the actual the mixing process. Chris and Michael, just to kind of follow up on what you're talking about. So I know you mixed in New Zealand at Park Road Post, which is the facility that Peter Jackson created down there. So Chris, you're the sound designer, and then you also mix the effects. So were you, I presume that you were doing your sound design in Pro Tools. So when it came time to, how much are you mixing while you're doing sound design? And then when you get into the dubbing stage, are you working on a Pro Tools control surface, or are you switching to a console at that point? Or kind of walk us through kind of what that process is.
In the sound design phase, I work from a traditional sort of perspective, having sort of come from the Ben Burton, Gary Rydstrom School of Sound Design. I create sounds for my editors to cut with. I also I really celebrate the creative talents that I had this incredible crew, and I celebrate their talents. And so I brought in Dave Kratzka was doing sound design as well. And then Dave Whitehead, who's worked on with me since Lord of the Rings. I asked him to come in. So I didn't want it to just be my vision. I wanted to bring in as many ideas as possible because I knew the client was that demanding that I didn't want to put it all on myself, really. And that worked in my favor because there were some things that Dave did that Jim latched onto, and likewise that Dave Kratzka did, and likewise Dave Whitehead just brought in this whole different way of working and actually taught me some new tricks, which I employ to this day. So, that's the first thing, is that you have to be really open to everybody's ideas when you have such a talented crew. It'd be foolish not to mine all of that creativity. Then we brought in Brent Burge, who I kind of dubbed him the effects supervisor, because while I was doing design and then ultimately going into pre-dubs, I couldn't manage this crew. And Brent has this amazing ability to just dive down into details like Gwen, that really helps keep things on focus. And he also edited Reel 1, which was a lot of fun as well. But so I would create sounds. Sometimes I'd cut them and then I'd give them to the editors and they go, "Oh yeah, nice job, Chris." But then they would do their part. And I have no ego on it. It's like, as long as we're getting down the road to a place where we can present something to Jim, I was happy. And then at a certain point, I needed to put down the Pro Tool, the sound design mode, and become a re-recording mixer. And I really do see it as two different jobs. And so at that point in time, I really kind of shut down my sound design room. I mean, I kept it open, but I really kind of divorced myself from thinking as a sound designer and went into the pre-dubs. And I had, as I said, this great crew that if I name everybody, I'll forget anybody. But Dave Kraska came down, who'd been working at Manhattan Beach. Matt Stutter came on board, and Hayden Kahlo, who, again, Matt and Hayden and I have a long relationship down at Park Road, as well as Dave Kraska and I having a long relationship at Skywalker, and Brent, and then this big Foley crew. So all of that stuff is percolating with all these editors cutting all this stuff, and then I go into the pre-dub process, and that's a challenging process because you have so much material and it's so good. And you don't really have time to say, well, I don't want that, I don't want that. You kind of just have to organize it all and pre-dub it all so that you have everything available, which is a blessing and a curse because you arrive at the final mix with everything available. And to some extent, you want Jim to hear everything so that he can see what the palette is that he has to play with. But that can also be frustrating for him because it's like, well, there's too much to process. So anyway, that was the creative process, sound design, supervising the editors, pre-dubbing, and then final mix. And in this film, I back on Lion King, I started moving more towards the S6. I was really adamantly opposed to going towards the S6 for a long time.
I remember.
Yeah, I know. I was thinking probably 20 plus years ago, you and I had dinner and you said, "Chris, you're going to be mixing on a Pro Tools console." And I said, "No way, Glenn. I love the DFC. I'm not coming off the DFC." And I still love the DFC. The truth is, for sound effects, well, look, the truth is that the Pro Tools mixing process has come a long way.
In your defense, it was nowhere near as good 20 years ago as it is.
Exactly.
So.
Exactly right.
The other thing is, this particular client, you had to be able to extract things. So you had,
yeah, that's true, Gwen. But don't forget, it was like a lot of things on this project. It was a blessing and a curse because
right.
As good as Pro Tools has become at being throughout the entire process. And I will say, in my defense as a sound designer, I did use the synclavier quite a bit when I was at Skywalker. But the process really was very Pro Tools centric. We created sounds in Pro Tools using Contact, using a Moog, using the synclavier. But then, it was all edited in Pro Tools. And I these days I tell my editors, hey, if you want to pan, go ahead and pan. But if you're going to pan in any given sequence, pan everything. Don't just pan some things, because then I have to spend time figuring out what wasn't panned. So anyway, I really believe in letting the editors take it as far as they can and present it the way they want, and then I pre-dub from there. But we went through the mix on a brand new console, and I called up Mike probably 2 years ago and I said, "Hedgie, you got to get that Euphonics off the stage because it's not going to be up to the job that we need it to be up to mix Avatar." And he was just at the first was like, "What? No, I love the S5."
This is from a guy that said, "No, we've got to have an S5 to do Lord of the Rings and for Hobbits and all of these other things." He was, no, we don't want any of that sort of Pro Tools platform. So. Yeah, I'll carry on a little, Chris, because the call came from Chris, and then John Landau comes into our suites and has a look at the S5s, and he'd obviously been talking to Chris, and he goes, no, we've got to have the S6s. It's the modern way, and so then we started to talk about different formats of the S6s and how we could build it into the S for Park Road for where we want to take our platform and that. And you're right, the S6 has certainly come a long way. And so we ended up fitting out the two big dub stages, the third dub stage, our near field rooms, all in S6s, just prior to Avatar hitting Park Road.
Very much prior, Hedgie, like by maybe a week.
Yeah. We used them all. We used every single one of those.
I'm kind of curious. I mean, obviously, as you guys have mentioned, there's a lot pulling Jim Cameron's attention. And, we didn't even talk about the fact that you guys are working and mixing and pre-dubbing for weeks and weeks and weeks I presume that you didn't have final picture that whole time, that there were tons of effect shots coming in at the last minute. And so during especially just talking about the final mix, what is Jim's approach to the final mix? Is he on stage with you every day? Does he come in for occasional playbacks? I presume he's still working with visual effects and doing his digital color grade and all of that at the same time. So how involved, I mean, I know obviously he's very involved, but what does that look like for Jim during the final mix?
He had 2 VFX reviews. He had one at 11, and then he had one at around 5. And sometimes John would cover most of them, but Jim was involved with a lot of them. We were also scoring through the entire final mix. So that was happening everything was happening at the end.
The one good thing about color grade and everything that was happening at the same time, Park Road has a theater which Jim took over with the laser projectors and had Tashi doing color grade like 5 minutes down the corridor, which the flexibility of that was fantastic because it allowed Jim to come backwards and forwards.
Jim did have 2 reviews a day, and so that meant that oftentimes we would get him early in the morning. What it meant in short was that because of his kind of wetter reviews were sort of in these specific hours, we ended up having to take a 12 o'clock lunch. And I was like, well, this doesn't work for my crew. I mean, we're going to work for, or actually we'd break at like 11:30. And I said, well, this doesn't work because people come in, work for 2.5 hours and then have to break for lunch. It just didn't work. And what I backed myself into unintentionally, because I'm not an early morning person, was we lived on an 8 o'clock roll. But that didn't, so we started working at 8 o'clock in the morning. But that didn't mean that we finished any earlier. And in some ways, so we got this sort of attention from Jim in the morning, attention from Jim in the afternoon. And then sometimes he would leave us with work that we could do into the evening, or sometimes he would return in the evening. And then when things got really intense was when he finally finished all his visual effects reviews, and then he had 100% of his time to put on us. And yeah, it got because obviously when Jim's on the stage, it's not our time to work; it's our time to work for him.
Yeah, and certainly he doesn't want to sit there and watch you noodle on stuff for quite some time.
No, I mean sometimes he would give us a note and it's hard for a director to know how complicated a note may or may not be. And so, you would try to do it as quickly as possible. But if he thought it was a simple note, it might have been a simple note, but sometimes it might be a complicated note. So yeah, it was, like we were mixing hard and fast from 8 in the morning till sometimes 9 or 10 at night. And that was 7 days a week. For months on end.
One thing that was good about him being on the stage is he didn't want to look at ugly picture. He didn't want any watermarks. He didn't want any burning. He wanted the picture. And so I think for the first time ever in my life, we had a completely, anything that was done, it was gorgeous. The last scene that was finished was the train crash in the very first reel. And in some ways, looking back on it, was kind of hilarious because he knew exactly where all these things happened, but it wasn't in the picture. He said, no, go 2 frames. That's where the explosion is. And so we were mixing to nothing. And then the picture would come in and he was right.
There was a couple of times, wasn't there, Gwen, where we, Jim would say, put the explosion here, and I'll talk to Weta and make sure they put the explosion there as well. And we're like, okay. I mean, for us, we live and die by sync. We're just kind of okay. And as Gwen said, it would work out because Jim, he knew exactly where it was almost by the frame, and he also had the power to adjust it if need be. But I have to say, while every day we had picture changes, the picture changes were not massive. They were a frame here, there, a frame there, and also outside of, there was a couple of scenes like the train scene in Reel 1 that remained what we call previs for a long time. We still had to work to those and then wait for them to become final. But for the most part, we had really good picture. This wasn't a situation where we were working to bad picture or dealing with massive changes. That was not really our challenge. Wouldn't you agree?
It also helped when he did the color timing and the visual effects reviews downstairs, he had our track with it. So he was always watching them. They weren't separate for him. Once we had a reel or a scene mixed, he listened to it in that other theater.
So congratulations. Avatar: Way of Water has made the short list for the Academy Award for Best Sound, one of the 10 pictures that has made the short list. I know the Bake Off is coming this weekend. Tell me about the reel. What reel did you put together to show at the Academy Bake Off this weekend?
The Bake Off reel is a piece that covers a beautiful part of where we think, where we get to know Piacon and Loak, and we see their first communication, and we see such a beauty of what the score can do and what the sound effects can do, and it takes you on that journey of where the Way of Water it takes us all. I think it's a really good representation of everything that we created, that Jim wanted to play, that I think will impress upon the viewer the importance of storytelling by sound. And it's a beautiful piece. I think it's fantastic.
In the old days, you got to put together like a 10-minute reel of just clips from the movie that showcase sound. But it's different now, right? You have to it's one continuous 10-minute sequence, right? It
is a continuous 10-minute sequence. And in the old days, it was a challenge to pick your favorite moments that you felt demonstrated the sound. In the new days, it's a challenge to pick a sequence that you can't touch, that you feel best demonstrates what we did. And it was a big debate among us. I mean, Gwen sort of picked this section, and I was like, but don't go any further. And really, you have to play that, you have to make compromises. And correct me if I'm wrong, Hedgie and Gwen, but I believe the scene and Julian, the scene opens with what we call the Akula attack.
No. It starts with the boys on the waves. They go.
It starts with the boys on the waves, but it includes the Akula attack, which is a very violent sequence.
But it helps that sharks don't have vocal cords, or shark-like creatures, so the creature can't scream because he has no vocal cords, which helps with the violence. And
then it goes to, as Hedgie described, it goes to, somehow Loak survives this incredible attack by the Akula, and he wakes up on a rock, or so we think.
That's one of my favorite sound design moments in the movie, because he's underwater, he's running out of air, and then you bring the heartbeats in, and the track it's so violent, but the track gets really quiet at that point, and it's just, I think you picked well. That's a beautiful sequence.
Well, what it does by going into the heartbeat is it just focuses you in on the world. Kind of at first, Loak is trying to control his heartbeat, and everything slows down, and you become connected with that. And then he realizes this isn't going to work. I got to get out of here. And then immediately finds himself in peril. And I do love this. In fact, it's even made me jump that, he wakes up on a rock, or so you think, and then he's woken up or sort of realizes that this is not a rock. This is a living creature I'm on when Payakan's blowhole.
When he walks across the blowholes, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, a fun sequence. And as Gwen said, it does let us demonstrate Payakan's language, and also lets us demonstrate Simon's incredible sweeping score.
Plus, in that sequence, there's ADR, there's FPR, there's production, and Mal. And you can't tell which one's which. They're all there.
Amazing. Well, obviously you find yourselves on the Dolby podcast. So I want to ask you, obviously underwater sequences are an extraordinary gift for Dolby Atmos. But I would love to ask you, what are your favorite, for the people who are seeing it in the theaters, or when it finally comes to home video, if they have an Atmos system at home, what are some of your most fun Atmos moments for people to listen for?
I have to say one of my favorites is in the rain scene on Pandora, and the rain's coming down and the kids are held captive, and Neytiri calls for them with her call, and it's like, boop, boop, and you don't know, is it a bird? Is it a person? Actually, I love that scene. I think in Atmos, it's just because it hides them and yet exposes them at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. That is a good scene. It really lends itself to the spatiality of the Atmos format. And what I've always found with Atmos is that the more simplistic scenes lend themselves better, because you can sort of pull the sounds apart and let the audience experience them from different directions. I would also say, in addition, I think of Reel 12, but it's basically the attack on when Jake and family and the Metakaina tribe attack the sea dragon to save their children. We employ Atmos for things like wings and different components that are happening around us, and I think that's a real celebration of the format in that sequence as well.
One of my favorites is Reel 1, when you're getting introduced back into the land of Pandora, and you've got, at the beginning, you've got all of the calls, all of the wildlife of Pandora, which invites you back into Pandora, which I think is really important to, set the scene, set the tones, all of that sort of thing. And as Chris said, the simplicity of that is something that Atmos does really well. But then again, later in that sequence, when you have date night and you're flying all through the beauty of Pandora, the music sweeping, and I was able to manipulate it all around us, was fantastic. And then the spaceships arrive, and my God, they arrive. And that's the power of Atmos as well.
Yeah, that was a moment that I second your opinion there, Hedgie. There's when we've met the spaceships up in space, and we're sort of looking down, and then the ship comes ripping through from the right surround, and that's a big Atmos moment, and meant to really kind of sell the raw power of this huge vessel coming down into the atmosphere. I love that moment.
Yeah, I love that, because I can remember Jim talking about it when we were filming it, and he wanted, and it was about that huge sound of a rocket. And he said, and it goes to the end where the sound sounds like it's distorted, but it's that cackle, and that sound of force and violence, and it's not it's not violent, but it's just like, it's immense. And I remember him talking about it so a long time before that. It's that thing, it's in his mind all the way through. And then Chris and Mike and Gwen and everybody at Park Road, like, actually put that to life, and they put that in the screen, and you hear it. And from hearing him talking to it to then hearing it actually in the final mix is kind of like, okay, yeah, wow, you've really absolutely nailed it, ticked the box, full 100%. It's like, that's it. It's amazing.
One thing I'd like to add there, probably, and Julian, you've just brought it back, is that Jim is a master storyteller, and during the mix, there were moments when he just sat there and he just explained in detail the whole concept of the scene, or what he was trying to portray, and he is so good at that. really enlightens you to understand why he wants the clarity. He will constantly say you can only concentrate on two things at once. And for him, the story is told by what you're hearing and what you're seeing, but you need that clarity. And so he explains it so well that we as re-recording mixers understand more of what his movie is. We can make our own movie, but that's not the point. We're making Jim Cameron's movie. And I think to have that clarity from a master storyteller and a master filmmaker such as Jim Cameron, I think was invaluable to where we ended up.
Thank you, Chris, Dick, Michael, Julian, and Gwen for joining us today. And a special thanks to our friends at Skywalker Sound who helped us put this conversation together. Considering how the film has already grossed almost $2 billion at the box office, you might have already seen Avatar: The Way of Water, but if you haven't, I cannot recommend it highly enough, either for the first time or for a repeat viewing. And if you have the chance to see it in a Dolby Cinema, in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos, I highly suggest that you do that. It's simply an incredible experience. We'll have a link to the film, as always, in our show notes. And if you haven't already, please make sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Institute podcast. It's awards season, and we will have more episodes just like this one coming up, including another in just a few days, focusing on the film Babylon. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms in our show notes, or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, thank you again for joining us. This is the Dolby Institute podcast. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon, and production support by Taylor Hines. And our production coordinator is Sunny Chen. Thanks for listening.